All right, we're ready to begin. Good afternoon and welcome to part 2 of Living in a Post-COVID-19 World, Navigating the Implications on Commercial and Residential Real Estate Laws in Light of the Pandemic. Thank you all for making the time to join us today. My name is Dina Salem and I'm the Managing Director of the House of Lebanon. On behalf of the House of Lebanon's Board of Trustees, Co-Chairman, and the President, I would like to welcome you all here today. I also would like to acknowledge all of the efforts of Ms. Wafa Hubbala and Ms. Crystal Haddad for facilitating today's event. Part 2 of Living in a Post-COVID-19 World is the second webinar in this series that was launched last month by the House of Lebanon and the Arab American Lawyers Association of Southern California. Its aim is to help businesses and individuals in our community navigate the practical changes brought about by COVID-19. Our two panelists today are attorneys at law with a specialty in real estate law. Today, they will be discussing how the economic downturn is affecting people's ability to keep up with payments of rents, the effects of the work from home movement and the shift toward it, and the future of residential and commercial development, and much more. So please join me in welcoming Rudy Salo, an infrastructure finance attorney at Nixon Peabody and a public speaker and writer who has been advising governmental entities and financial institutions on financing transportation systems and other infrastructure throughout the United States. Also joining us today is Vanessa Haddad. As a real estate attorney, Vanessa, who is also a broker at CBRE, focuses on advising clients in the disposition and acquisition of retail properties throughout Southern California. Her motto is relentless persistence, and it stems from her rigorous training and background in real estate law. Lastly, should any attendee need MCLE credit, please email me directly at Dina, that's D-I-N-A, at houseoflebanon.com, and I will facilitate the credit with the Arab American Lawyers Association of Southern California. Now, before we begin, a few things. I would like to let you know that the meeting is being recorded, so we can later on share that meeting on digital platforms later. So, and I also would like to remind you all to please kindly turn off your audio and video during the webinar. You can send me your questions via the chat box, and I will relay them to the panelists. As soon as they're done with their webinars and presentations, they will try to answer as many of them as they can. We will have a Q&A segment right after the presentations. So I will hand it over to Vanessa. Vanessa, you can take it away. Vanessa, you're muted. Okay, let me see. Let's make sure.
Sorry about that, guys. Thank you, Dina, so much. Let me just share my screen so you guys get to see the PowerPoint slide as I talk through this here with you. All right, so can you guys see this screen?
Yes, we can.
Okay. Happy Tuesday, everyone. Welcome to summer. Today, I will give a 20-minute overview about the current market and investment outlook as it relates to COVID-19. Being that I specialize in the retail sector of the commercial real estate world, I figured it would be a naturally good place for me to start. There's a lot of information I'm just going to run through, and we're going to cover the overview of the state of retail. I'll talk about the retail drivers and recovery signals. I'll discuss what's happening in real time, Q3 of 2020, as it relates to the retail investment market. We'll look at some trends, some predictions, and since some of our listeners are part of the Lawyers Association, we will take a look at some proposed legislation, government responses, and I'll touch on their implications. And I will end by answering one of the most popular questions I get, which is where are property values headed? So let's start off with an overview of the state of retail. The retail sector, which was hit very hard by store closures and stay-at-home orders, posted remarkably strong job gains in May. We experienced one of the highest one-month job gains in U.S. history, and retail accounted for over 70% of those added jobs. So where do we see retail going? The retail recovery is obviously going to depend and vary significantly on geography, asset type, and retail category. In general, the macro retail drivers of demand are consumer sentiment and personal income. So as to consumer sentiment has been up. Stocks have been rallying up, and in terms of sales, obviously the big story here was looking at the May spike. which surpassed expectations by almost double. And this is a very interesting chart that overlays the year-over-year sales recovery, comparing China to that of the US. And what it really shows is that China's recovery was much more gradual. It's been more progressive. Conversely, in the US, we saw this huge spike in May. And if we look at some global sales in the markets that reopened back in Europe, you could see that Spain and Italy looked a lot more like the US. There was a very strong kind of immediate V-like recovery. Belgium was more like China, a lot more gradual. Germany and France are somewhere in the middle, and UK just opened last week, so we don't have any data on them yet. But consumer sentiment is generally up. And now, as to personal income, the second driver of retail demand, there's said to be plenty of dry powder out there now. But this is something we have to be cautiously optimistic about. In the US, looking at the sales and where do we go from here? I mean, May was a huge month. We saw additional unemployment benefits in place. The stimulus checks were received, and there was a surge in the stock market. And then, of course, there was the reopenings. Everyone was pent up, trying to get out there and shop again. So while optimistic about sales growth and continual rebound, I do think that we can expect to see some leveling off of this trajectory come late July and into August. What's happening today in real time for Q3 of 2020? So the old news is we used to just look at whether or not a retailer was internet resistant. We have now seen that retail has been broken down into two categories, which investors will inherently take into consideration in the future. And these two categories are essential and non-essential uses. E-commerce, as you probably would have guessed, is spiking across most retail categories, but it's unsustainable for retail operators as home delivery eats significantly into margins. We'll take a closer look at some case studies in just a few minutes. In retail today, we're seeing an acceleration of 5 to 10 years' worth of trends that have been fast-tracked in the past few months. We're seeing the reorganization of retailers who recently filed for bankruptcy. The tenants who filed for bankruptcy are the same tenants that were already on the watch list. So these bankruptcies didn't really come as a surprise. What did come as a surprise, and by the way, this list is missing Chuck E. Cheese, which just filed for bankruptcy last week. What did come as a surprise, however, was the sudden shift in restaurant stabilities. So in 2015, as you could see, the first 15% says restaurants. It surpassed grocery sales back in 2015 that were only at 14% for the first time in history. And this was said to be due to the millennial population taking over the baby boomers and viewing dining out as more of a social event rather than just a place to go eat. So as you can see here, the blue line are the grocery sales, always dominant, right? The yellow line are the restaurant and bar sales. And you'll see right over here in 2015, boom, for the first time, crossed over and surpassed sales. And this, so here, it's restaurant sales, right, that are the lighter green category. And you can see how they continually, since 2015 all the way up till now, surpassed grocery sales. Now, because of this, restaurants were always highly sought after because they were considered internet proof, but we have since learned that they're not pandemic proof. So when the inverse happened, a lot of people thought it was due to the government mandated closures, which I'm sure has a lot to do with it. But a study in Arizona came out and looked at the correlation between foot traffic and the spike in cases. And the study found that people are actually pretty good at policing themselves. And most metropolitan areas saw massive drops in restaurant activity even before the state mandated lockdowns were put in place. So it's going to be very important for restaurants to take safety measures to make consumers feel safe about eating in and also ordering food from their establishments. Hayek and OpenTable now estimate that about a quarter of U.S. restaurants will not survive the pandemic. The Independent Restaurant Coalition predicts that as many as 80% of the independent restaurants will fold because of the pandemic. So with more people at home, delivery services were really the big winners here. Online grocery sales rose up to 65% to $6.6 billion in May from March. Instacart gained huge ground since COVID and now accounts for over 54% of all online grocery delivery sales. The problem, however, is the cost. So retailers have had to modify their operations in order to manage the jump in delivery demand by hiring thousands of additional workers, devoting some of their stores to fulfilling online orders. And that work is pushing up costs that eat into margins on delivery sales, which echoes the troubles that restaurants have had to deal with when delivering food to their consumer while also trying to protect their bottom line. So the solution to the problem is really the problem. Shipping costs and e-commerce and cleanup aren't profitable. Staying open during the pandemic wasn't cheap. Many of the big companies say that they spend anywhere from up to hundreds of thousands to almost $1 billion in COVID-19 related costs. Here are some samples of how much it cost these big boxes to stay open during COVID. It cost Target $1 billion. It cost Walmart $900 million. Kroger spent $830 million. Home Depot $640. Now, just to put it in perspective, Amazon sales grew 24% year over year, up to $36.7 billion. But guess what? It actually resulted in a net loss, a 29% drop in net income for quarter one. Why? Because fulfillments were up, costs were up by 49%. Sorry, actually, shipping costs were up by 49%. Fulfillment costs were up by 11%. We heard the same thing happen with Home Depot. Sales were up by 8%, profits fell 12%. Wayfair, 20% profits, but a net loss of over 43%. So as you can see, this is an area that's in desperate need of a solution and would be a highly lucrative for an innovator that comes up with a cost-effective solution to this problem. More emerging areas to look out for in the future include the following. So here are some of my predictions, or predictions that CBRE as a whole is talking about. Populations will move to more open areas as opposed to urban. Historically, epidemics have pushed populations out of city. Think 9/11, think the 1918 flu pandemic. San Francisco is already seeing that rents have dropped more than 9%, the largest decline ever. And they've also reported vacancies that rose up to 6.2% in May. You're going to start seeing a lot of contactless takeover. So no touch tech will be key. You're going to see a lot of payment through apps. You're going to see a lot of robots replacing humans where possible. South Korea is already doing this. One of their larger movie chain theaters are running a contact-free trial in its theaters, and this offers a glimpse as to what movie-going in the future may look like. You're going to see a lot more digital menus. Some of you may have already seen this. If you've gone out, you basically take your phone and hover it over a barcode, and the menu appears directly on your phone. You're going to see a lot of integrated health clinics. So we saw this trend pre-COVID. You saw that CVS was very forward-thinking in opening up what they called minute clinics inside their own stores. You're going to start to see clinics more integrated in office buildings and the continual integration of them in retail. Insurance is definitely going to spike in retail, as many of you probably predicted. Stores will convert to smaller footprints. There was several instances of this over the past few years, and it was definitely a trend we saw pre-COVID that has been accelerated today. But the newest smaller footprint members are Target, who's usually about 50,000 to 80,000 square feet, have shrunken their size down to 25 to 30. Walgreens is rumored to be considering footprints as small as 5,000 square feet when they're typically 13 to 15,000 square feet. Nike, despite their 38% drop in revenue, plan to open up 200 smaller footprint stores, and that's because they understand the importance of smaller footprints. When I say smaller footprints, I mean gross leasable area. Kohl's was great. You know, before COVID, they had already done a lot of these things. So they had shrunken their footprint. They diversified to minimize their risk by adding and partnering up with other retailers like Amazon, Planet Fitness, and Aldi. I have a picture of this. So that's helped them tremendously during this time. Online leasing, you're going to see a lot of it both on the commercial and residential end. Requests from prospective tenants for in-person visits have dropped by about 40%, but virtual tours have spiked up by 140%. And the majority of renters who tour space virtually said that that's all that they needed to make a leasing decision. You're going to see more of an enhanced fitting room policy. You already saw places like Ferragamo and Versace said that you're you're not allowed to try on their clothes anymore. But I think a lot of states are going to copy what New York has been allowing, which is fitting rooms, if only if they're equipped with appropriate cleaning and hygiene supplies. And you're going to have to disinfect, or the stores will have to disinfect after each use, the dressing rooms. You're going to see the implementation of curbside pickup. It's going to be permanent. So pickup has been the preferred option for many shoppers during the pandemic. Pickup sales as of mid-June were up 81% compared to the earlier year, while delivery grew only 33% during the same time frame. Target has remained the pickup destination, with e-commerce up 141% in its most recent financial quarter. Domino's, Chick-fil-A, Panera Bread, Starbucks are some of the few that are rolling out permanent curbside pickup. Malls will turn into colleges. Discounters are poised to do very well. So typically with recession, you'll see the consumer be more budget conscious, and retailers have already seen a more budget conscious trend. So grocery outlet, where products are priced as much as 70% lower than their competitors, found a 30% increase in consumer base, mostly comprised of millennials. Dollar stores are doing very well. Their sales are up 103%. Stores like Ross and TJ Maxx are poised to do very well and see gains, especially with the increase of inventory that they'll be getting from the bigger boxes that have been shuttering. I predict that TJ Maxx will perform a little better than Ross because its online delivery platform or online platform is much more developed, and they're not just limited to apparel. They carry more home furniture items, which have been doing great during COVID, and Rudy will touch on those in just a few minutes. So lastly, last trend that I think you'll see is that middle tier gyms will disappear. Consumers are switching over to the less expensive fitness facilities such as Planet Fitness or boutique studio classes. A lot of people are doing the in-home alternatives. So Peloton saw a surge in members because of the pandemic, and Equinox came out with an in-home alternative for its members as well. And just today, we saw that Lululemon is trying to purchase Mirror, which is an at-home fitness startup, for $500 million. So this at-home fitness is definitely going to be a place where there's a lot of growth. Now, for the Lawyers Association, here are some, I also forgot to mention, LA Fitness have also responded by rolling out a new concept called a Sporta, which basically starts off at $10 a month, and members can pay for add-on fees. So a lot of people are switching over to the lower price or at-home gyms. Now, state and legislator reactions, relief measures. So over the past several months since this pandemic hit, we've seen a lot of legislation. In California alone, over 120 bills have been proposed, many of which are much too broad and myopic. Now, in the interest of time, I'm just going to touch on 4 topics I believe pertain the most to our listeners today. Right off the bat, when the pandemic hit, the first words out of everyone's mouths were force majeure. Last week, we received a more comprehensive interpretation of one bankruptcy court's application and interpretation of the clause as it relates to COVID-19. So the force majeure clause, may waive the parties' responsibilities if an unforeseen act, as defined by the contract, prevents either one of them from meeting their responsibilities. A bankruptcy court in Illinois has ruled that a restaurant tenant is excused from some of its contractual obligations to its landlord, citing the force majeure clause. So here, the judge decided that the tenant's rent obligation should be prorated to just the percentage of the restaurant that was still in use during the pandemic. Here, the kitchen and back of house were still being used for takeout and delivery orders, and it only accounted for 25% of the gross leasable area. So the judge directed the restaurant tenant to pay only 25% of its rent. The landlord argued that the tenant could have used the money that they obtained through PPP, but the judge dismissed that argument, saying that the force majeure clause in the lease in question said nothing about borrowing money to meet its obligations. So that was a very interesting case, and we'll love to see how that plays out. The reaction to the eviction moratorium and rent freezes. We saw on June 11th that the Apartment Association of LA filed a federal lawsuit arguing that the city's eviction moratorium violates the U.S. Constitution, California Constitution, and state law. We'll see. We saw actually two places in Southern California already, Duarte and Upland, where the government leaders had actually repealed the bans on commercial and residential evictions after property owners threatened to file suit. Now, currently, to avoid eviction, renters would need to pay all past due rent, kind of like a balloon payment, once the emergency order is lifted. So there's currently no statewide protection to shield the renters from eviction once the courts reopen post-COVID. Lawmakers came up with Assembly Bill 1436, which would force landlords to defer rents up to 15 months after the state or local government has lifted the emergency. But that's very myopic in view because it doesn't deal with the expenses that the landlord is left to grapple with in the meantime. So another bill that came out was Senate Bill 1410. I think it proposes a happy medium between both tenant and landlord because it proposes that basically it'll be a state-funded rent voucher program to help pay the deferred rent and provide stability to those renters who are recovering so long as they remain current on their contractual obligations. The last thing I want to touch on is how LA City recently voted to create a $100 million rent relief program to help impacted families. The money would basically be coming from the federal funds that Washington had allocated. It's as part of the coronavirus relief package that they released in April. All right, it's finally time for everyone's favorite question. Where are property values headed? So, given the severity of the current economic crisis, cap rates are likely to increase throughout 2021, which means property prices will compress because these two work inversely with each other. So as cap rates go up, prices go down. Because of rent renegotiations that many of the landlords have had to deal with, we will see a decline in asset value growth, but expect to see a strong recovery at the later end of 2021 into 2022. Industrial is basically the only sector that shows a positive appreciation return in 2020. I left a slide here of just basic overview points that you guys can take a look at. Dina's going to be sending off these slides at the end of this call. So feel free to ask me any questions in the question comments, and Rudy, I'll pass it on to you.
Hey, thanks everybody. Great presentation.
Thanks.
My name is Rudy Salo. I am an infrastructure finance attorney at the law firm of Nixon Peabody here in downtown Los Angeles. I'm actually in the office as a lawyer. We are considered essential workers. So I decided to come in today and not do Zoom from home because I got young kids and who knows if internet access will go out. But what does it mean to be an infrastructure finance attorney, and how is that connected to real estate? Well, basically, I help local governments, state governments, nonprofits access the tax-exempt and taxable bond markets in order to build buildings and roads and other types of infrastructure that we all use that keeps our entire country together. Though the financings are usually done via municipal bonds, although I represent a lot of financial institutions like the big national banks or big regional banks in making loans to local governments and nonprofits. Some of the buildings that we build are, the very obvious real estate buildings are hospitals, there's schools, there's sports stadiums, there's anything and everything that you can think of. Other than residential real estate. Sometimes there's a commercial real estate aspect to it, in particular back when the redevelopment agencies were involved, but it's mostly government real estate and nonprofit infrastructure and the like. My primary discussion today is, Dina, if you could share your screen and put my slides up. It is going to be on COVID-19, the future of cities, development, and transportation. Next slide. Here's an overview of what we're going to discuss today. What I'm seeing driving around Los Angeles. Number two, we're going to talk about how COVID-19 will affect the future of cities and infrastructure, and primarily focusing on the transportation aspect of that. And I'll get into why transportation is a key factor when you're considering real estate and its effect thereof. Number three, driverless cars. Is COVID-19 what we needed to take the next great leap forward in transportation and development? And number four, how will COVID-19 affect the future of government revenues? The next slide. Okay. What's it really like out there? When I'm driving around, I'm sure you guys are seeing the same thing that I'm seeing. I live in the South Bay of Los Angeles, and when I drive Sepulveda/PCH, in particular south from LAX all the way down, towards the Palos Verdes Peninsula, I am seeing row after row of for lease sign or commercial real estate for sale. I mean, it's literally blocks upon blocks of empty storefronts. Restaurants that have gone out of business. If this surge continues to be as bad as we think it's going to be, I think it could just get worse. And that causes a lot of concern for me. That's what I'm seeing on the commercial real estate side of the fence. Residential real estate, completely different story. The low inventory trend continues. The home is truly become the castle. The home has truly become where everybody is doubling down on staying, obviously for numerous reasons, because a lot of our jobs, if we're lucky enough to have them, can be done out of our house. Here in California, over the last couple of years, there was an interesting trend. State law started to allow accessory dwelling units, or ADUs, and just this past year, junior accessory dwelling units were also allowed. So there were already some state law allowances for expanding the home, build the granny flat and build a little office. It's already there pre-COVID-19. And I think that's just going to continue to happen. I think that residential real estate is going to be very low inventory. And I have very good friends that are that are realtors, and that are a good friend of mine, Mark Farley, is a realtor down in San Diego. And he posts a lot of articles about that trend. And I'm thinking that's going to continue because people are just going to want to stay home and build out all the projects that they always wanted to do at home if they're lucky enough to pay for it. Next slide. Okay, so the link between why do I like to always talk about transportation and real estate? Well, everything comes down to location, location, location. Just last year, the American Public Transportation Association and National Association of Realtors released a report, there's a picture of it, that linked the proximity of real estate closer to transit to higher values. So pre-COVID-19, in particular, if you had transit in where you lived, if you were closer to transit, you tended to find higher value. So there's a link right there. But before COVID-19, the data said transit creates value, it influences development and business, location decisions, and if you further support public transit expansion, it can further propel development and housing opportunities. I actually put a picture of the report right there because I think it's a really good picture of the development that was transit-oriented. A lot of the big development in Los Angeles, as you can see when you were driving around anywhere near any of the transit lines, you'd see a lot of cranes. It was transit-oriented development. Next slide. Even though there was a lot of transit-oriented development in Los Angeles, transit ridership was actually dropping in Los Angeles prior to COVID-19. One of the reasons why, and I wrote about this in a Forbes.com article. I'm a transportation contributor to Forbes.com. One of the reasons why was because of the values around those transit stations was getting so high. The rents were getting high. The purchase of homes near transit was getting so high that it drove out the normal commuters that use that transit. So that was one reason why transit was already dropping. And like I said before COVID-19, cranes littered sections of Los Angeles, including booming neighborhoods near transit lines. Multi-unit apartment buildings were being constructed. Boomers and others were abandoning the suburbs, moving to Los Angeles and other cities, driving up real estate prices in and around transit-oriented development. Now, post COVID-19, what's the future going to look like? The next slide, please. Okay. This is the title of an article that just came out on Sunday in the Wall Street Journal. You can look at it. Public transit use is associated with higher coronavirus death rates, researchers find. Now, if you look at that and you were even had an inkling to go into a train or a bus or anything, you just freak out and say, forget it, I'm going to drive. I'm done with public transportation. It's over with for me. I'm not going to use it anymore. I could personally tell you that prior to COVID-19, I was one of the biggest proponents of public transportation. I wrote about it. I write about it in Forbes.com. I talk about it nonstop on multiple podcasts. I would talk about the benefits of public transportation, the benefits to our environment, the benefits to your health, the benefits to letting someone else do the driving. And I can tell you right now, I haven't been inside of a train since the middle of February. And quite frankly, I don't plan on doing so until, God willing, there's a vaccine that's released out there. And so how will that affect things? Next slide. Okay. Traffic. All right. Here's the thing. With everybody working from home lately and more jobs being probably going the way of being permanent at-home jobs, as you're driving around Los Angeles, just like I'm driving around Los Angeles, you're probably like, hey, I dig this. This is pretty cool. I can get from point A to point B, and it doesn't take me an extra hour and a half. So, when things get closer back towards quote unquote normal, will more commuters take advantage of less congested roads? Will COVID-19 lead to the doubling down of the automobile as being the transportation mode of choice in Los Angeles? It was always there. LA's a car city, and we had the red car, and we tore it out back in the 40s, 50s, and 60s, and the automobile dominated, and then traffic became just so terrible that eventually we built out all these train lines, and we have loads and loads of projects that we've funded through all of the sales tax measures that we've passed here in Los Angeles County and elsewhere. So those projects are still going to be built, but at the end of the day, COVID-19 probably will lead to the automobile still just being the choice for Angelino. So I do think it will have an impact on the future of public transportation. Next slide. Okay, COVID-19's impact as well as in future transportation. Look, prior to COVID-19, when you went to any city that had any kind of a downtown cluster, you probably saw a whole bunch of scooters or rentable bikes. That was the micro-mobility movement. The use of those bikes, the whole purpose of them was to address the first mile, last mile solution. Transit lines don't go everywhere. How do you get from where the transit line ends to a building or someplace that you need to go? Well, these scooter companies like Spin and Bird and all these other types of, and Lime came in and really saw an opportunity, and you saw them everywhere. Well, if you drive around cities now, there's not that many people, and there's a lot of scooters that are being left around. What's going to happen to those micromobility companies? Will there be a massive amount of bankruptcy? Will city streets be littered with ghostly, unusable micro vehicles? We shall see. Global infrastructure development. In the post-COVID-19 world, will private companies think twice about participating in public-private partnerships overseas if future outbreaks could cause disruption to the development and operation of those P3s due to fears of developing abroad? I do think that development in developing countries, as far as if any of that development was brought on by investors from other countries, I think that's going to slow down as a result of COVID-19, and people start thinking twice about, going into particular areas and exposing themselves. Reuse and refashioning of city streets. Prior to COVID-19, the curb space was extremely valuable. Rideshare companies, Uber, Lyft, they picking up people from the streets, and everyone was talking about the reuse and the rethinking of the curb. Now, as a result of COVID-19, some cities are rethinking the streets in order to let restaurants operate out in the middle of the streets and take it from the outside and make it more outdoor because it's safer. Is that going to be a temporary thing, or is it going to be a permanent thing? If more and more people are using cars to get around, is the shutting down of streets really something that should be considered? I don't know. We'll have to see how that goes. Next slide. Okay. Something that I've been focused on for many, many years is driverless cars. And what I've been arguing for many years about driverless cars is that they're already here. You can go onto YouTube for several years and you can go see driverless cars, cars driving themselves and be oohed and awed. And I say, so what? A driverless car that's not connected to the road that it drives on via traffic signals and other infrastructure and isn't communicating with other vehicles on the road is simply a car without a driver. And in my opinion, that is not a great leap in transportation, like we had when the wheel was invented or the boat was used, the horse, railroads, and then the automobile. Those great leaps in transportation massively affected where people live and where people work. And the way our cities look. Driverless cars could get us to the reshaping of development if we not just have the car without a driver, but we have to redo all of our infrastructure in order to maximize the safety and efficiency of driverless cars. Next slide. You went too far. One more back. Yeah. So what are we talking about when we're talking about driverless technology and infrastructure? Vehicle-to-vehicle system. One car talking to another car, telling it which direction it's going to go and its speed. V2V and V2I. V2I means vehicle to infrastructure. For example, a vehicle to infrastructure system would connect a car and the roadway. For example, if a bridge is unexpectedly shut down, it would alert drivers to slow down or take alert the cars to take another route or to go a different direction. That would all be connected via infrastructure. Sensor reflectors or beacons added to existing signage infrastructure are likely to enhance some driverless vehicle operations. Additional electronic equipment such as controllers may be needed to be added to transportation infrastructure, probably along existing rights of way. What I've been arguing for years is the rollout of driverless cars should be staged. I think we should have dedicated driverless car lanes where no human, quote unquote, drivers or cars that can be driven by the class 1 or class 2 cars. There's 5 classes of driverless technology, 3, 4, and 5 being more on the autonomous side. Only those classes of driverless cars should be able to use that lane. We could gain data and learn from that particular lane and how drivers and cars are working in order to rebuild out our more driverless car friendly infrastructure. But at the end of the day, who's going to pay for all of this? Next slide. Infrastructure is primarily funded by local governments or state governments. Those are primarily done with municipal bonds. And municipal bonds, just in case if anybody knows, it's a municipal bond. A tax-exempt municipal bond is something that's only within the United States. If you own a tax-exempt municipal bond, the interest on that bond you don't need to remit payments towards the federal government. Think about it as like a federal subsidy towards infrastructure. The federal government says, nope, you can keep that interest to yourself. As a result, borrowers take on a lower interest rate, and that's primarily how the United States has been built out. And those are repaid back, by the way, from government revenues. One source of government revenues is from us, from property owners. Property owners pay property taxes. Those property taxes go towards infrastructure and for other uses. Another way to repay back municipal bonds is through sales taxes. So the sales taxes, a portion of sales taxes is used to build out transit lines within LA County or in other aspects. But what are the long-term impacts coronavirus may have on government revenues, which ultimately would result in cuts in services and affect our lives? Well, it's very clear. Airports, there's not that many passenger facility charges that are used to repay back bonds that have been used to construct airports. Those are down. So we already know there's some airports are in trouble. Hotels. When you go and rent a hotel room, you're paying a transit occupancy tax. A portion of that goes towards, your use of the infrastructure that's around that help to get you to that hotel. TOTs are going to be down. Sales taxes is kind of interesting because there has been a surge in purchases and sales. People buying things for the home. And a couple of years ago, the Supreme Court confirmed that sales taxes on online sales can be collected by state governments. So that's at least one good thing. But another use of sales taxes are tourist dollars. If there's no tourists in your area, sales taxes are obviously going to drop, and there's other effects. Public transportation, certain public transportation systems are financed through sales taxes. Other transit lines like BART up in San Francisco actually use the fare box. So when you buy a ticket, you're paying for that train. Transit ridership was already trending down. Will COVID-19 be a nuclear bomb? And the next time that we're being asked to fund transit via sales tax measures, if we're doubling down on the automobile and no one's using public transportation, or not no one, but not using it as much, how's that going to affect the willingness of voters to build out those transit lines? And if we're not willing to build out those transit lines, how's that going to affect transit-oriented development? Transportation finance today, just so you know, one of the primary methods of financing transportation infrastructure in the United States is through the gas tax. That's at the federal level and the state level. One of the issues with the gas tax is even if more people are driving, because they're not taking public transportation, there are a lot more electric vehicles within the United States. And electric vehicles, you don't pay the gas tax. So the Highway Trust Fund isn't fully funded because we haven't solved for the electric vehicle problem. I mean, if we're going to be thinking about, building out more roads and building out more transportation infrastructure, we're going to need to rethink how we do the funding for such big projects like that. And so that all just comes into play. I'm trying to tie it all together. You really can't divorce real estate from transportation. They go part and parcel together when you're thinking about values and the future of development in the future. And a big part of that is, the government revenues that are being funded in order to build out that infrastructure. So everything kind of lines up together. COVID-19 is clearly going to have an impact on our lives. We don't know if it's going to be temporary or permanent yet. It's something that I'm watching. It's something that I'm talking about on a lot of podcasts. I'm on one called Good is in the Details that I talk a lot about this about. I write about this on Forbes.com. And if you're interested in learning more about it, just look me up. This is me. Like I said, I'm a partner in Nixon Peabody. I do public finance. I do infrastructure. And I thank all of you for listening to this discussion. I'll turn it back over to Dina to, see if anybody has any questions.
Yeah, we sure do. Let's see. I will be sending them to you and Vanessa, but as I get organized, I do have one question for Vanessa about the value of property. Since you are working with CBRE, will there be a significant drop in prices for homes, condos, etc.? And when, in your opinion, will be a good time to buy? So that's one question, and I'm going to send more your way. Okay. Yeah. All right. I'm not sure if Vanessa's with us. Vanessa?
Hi, yes, I'm with you.
Perfect.
Okay, great question. It's a question I get often. I think that a good time to buy is going to be towards the beginning, the latter end of this year throughout 2021. But you're going to start seeing property prices pick back up towards the end of 2021 and into 2022.
I do have another one here as also for Vanessa. Will landlords be expected to pay taxes for unoccupied units, or do they? I'm not sure. How will that affect rent prices as well?
That's a great question. There was I believe that there's an assembly bill, right? That's going after taxes. Let me see if I remember it. Basically, it was a measure, a tax relief measure for commercial property owners. I know that they're seeking some tax relief for the decline in property values due to the coronavirus pandemic. You're going to have to continue to push your local assessor's office. I think currently under California law, a property owner, I know that if they experience some sort of calamity, like an emergency earthquake, fire, other disaster on the property, you can apply for a reassessment. I think the County Assessors Association said that the proposal, I think the California state tried to propose a reassessment, but it was rejected. They said that it would go against the state's constitution since the damage had to be physical damage, and the drop in property taxes could result in massive shortfall for local city budgets. The state constitution allows legislators to provide relief in the case of physical damage, but from a constitutional perspective, we have to ask, does the restricted access constitute as physical damage? That's something that you're going to have to, we're going to have to wait and see, but it's an argument to be made.
Great. And I'm sure you got that question. How about commercial real estate prices? We have a question from one of the participants, Talat.
How about commercial real estate prices? Prices have held right now, generally speaking. Pre-COVID prices, especially if you're looking at single tenant net leased assets, those are, easy. They're one lease, one tenant, especially if they're an essential use like a dollar store, convenience store, or market or drugstore. The multi-tenant centers are kind of on hold now. They're very hard to underwrite. We are seeing about a 15% drop in prices, but that's debt driven. It's what the appraisers are coming back with. And that's for multi-tenant. I hope that answered your question. How about commercial real estate prices? I mean, I don't know if you guys know this, but there was an extension for a 1031 exchange deadline where basically people were able to extend they only have 3 months after they close, typically, to avoid paying capital gains tax. If that deadline, kind of like how your taxes got pushed back to July 5th or into July, the new deadline for 1031 exchanges is July 15th. So that's approaching. So yeah, we are seeing a lot of activity because there's a lot of activity and not a lot of product. The prices have remained stable. It'll be interesting to see what happens after that. So I do predict a dip in 2021, but that dip is expected to pick back up the latter end of 2021 and into 2022.
Thank you, Vanessa. And so Rudy, we do have a question for you about the new budget plan that was passed by Governor Newsom, in which there's lots of cuts and increase in taxes on businesses, etc. And the question is, how does it affect transportation budget, in your opinion, and hence transportation in general in LA?
Yeah, I mean, so as I mentioned previously, there's two primary ways that transportation is financed in the United States, and then in particular in California. So one of the primary ways is the gas tax, right? So money every time you go to the pump, no matter what no matter how much gas is whatever the price is, you're paying a set amount of the taxes, federal and state. The other way of paying for transportation is through sales tax measures. Here in Los Angeles County, we've passed 4 sales tax measures: 1980, 1990, 2008, 2016, and a small little portion of your sales tax here in LA County goes towards transportation. At the state level, there's the State Transportation Fund. If there have been cuts to that in the budget, which I'm sure there are, I haven't gotten down deep into it, that will affect all of the transit agencies throughout the United States. Transportation finance these days is really tricky. I'm working on a number of deals, one in Nevada, a number of transportation agency deals here in the state of California, and a lot of them have gone to banks and they're borrowing, and they're saying, hey, look, here's where we're at. Will you lend to us? And, thankfully most banks have stepped up and they're willing to have that ongoing partnership. Banks play a critical role. Financial institutions play a critical role in transportation and in development and in municipal finance. So whatever cuts that are made at the state hopefully they're on a temporary basis and banks can come in and fill in that gap. That's what my hope is. That's what I'm seeing on some deals.
Thank you. So I have a question that's not particularly addressed to either of you, but you feel free to sort it out. Patrick asks, what is the outlook on the multifamily market? Do you see skepticism in renting an apartment where you share spaces with other tenants?
I'll let the real estate expert address that. But, in my 2 cents, I think it's going to have some kind of an effect, right? If you have a building that is so large that you need to have elevators rather than staircase, and a garden apartment versus multi-layered, I think people will think twice about it. I think that goes to my point about residential and truly single family residences are, in my opinion, are going to continue to increase in value, and that's one of the reasons why sales have plummeted. There's just not that much being put onto the market right now. We have an affordable housing crisis here in California. COVID-19 is going to make it worse. If a lot more people are working from home, and if they had a roommate, right, and if they were renting out a room to a roommate, but now they're going to work from home permanently, and they need that room in order to work out of, they turn to the roommate and say, hey, I'm working from home. I need that room. You got to go find your own place. Well, that roommate's got to go find his own place or her place. So I think the affordable housing crisis is going to get worse. I think the development outside of city centers, deeper into the suburbs, will occur. And I really think there's going to be an explosion in suburban development and more rural development once broadband internet gets expanded. One of the major issues of rural living or outside of suburban living is actually broadband internet access. I actually have plenty of people that do live and not in cities that have to use dial-up internet or satellite internet, which is really spotty. So I think if you really want to watch some trends of the real estate market, find out where broadband is being expanded. People are putting a lot of money in expanding their broadband, and that would be good places to buy. That's just my 2 cents.
Thank you, Rudy. Vanessa, do you think you have any input on Patrick's question? I can, it's about the outlook on the multifamily market, and you're on mute. You're still on mute. Let me unmute you. So.
There you go. Can you hear me now?
Yes.
I was just saying there's a lot of momentum for multifamily. The demand currently is much higher than supply, which, as you know, drives prices up. And because of the stay-at-home orders, the vacancy has been lower. So prices have actually held. I don't see skepticism, to be honest with you, about sharing spaces with other tenants, because you have to think of it like a shared home. I mean, in a single family home, there are typically more than just one person living inside, and I don't think that's going to affect values as much. I don't specialize in multifamily. I specialize in retail, but from what I've seen and the reports I've gathered, renters are paying rent. Vacancy is low. There is high demand. I don't see it going anywhere. But on a landlord's perspective and point of view, I think it's going to be held to manage because of all these laws that have been, happening with the moratorium on rents and evictions. I mean, it's very scary right now for a landlord. So that's my 2 cents.
That's awesome. I think that's all the questions I have so far. So if any of the participants would like to ask any questions, you can send me an email later before we wrap up. And I really, really thank you all. I think that concludes our webinar. And thank you, Vanessa and Rudy. That was really, really helpful today, having listened to this really important topic at this time. I will be emailing the recording of the webinar and the presentations as soon as they're ready. And I guess that's a wrap. So I'll see you hopefully next time on our next session.
Thanks, everyone. Stay safe and healthy.
Bye-bye.
Bye.
Okay, I will end the meeting now. Okay.